You'll remember last year Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that he was going to appoint a special envoy on anti-Semitism. Envoy, sorry, I should say. I've been in trouble for this one before when I've said envoy. The correspondence I get from viewers to remind me that it is envoy, so I will relearn it. I'm sorry. He said he would appoint a special envoy on anti-Semitism, but of course at the same time we need a special envoy on Islamophobia as well, because, you know, that's just as bad as anti-Semitism, but whatever. Gillian Segal was the woman he appointed. Now, I said at the time, this is going to do nothing. The Prime Minister, since October the 7th, 2023, has shown little regard for anti-Semitism in this country. All this really is window dressing. I mean, as if he needs to appoint someone on a public salary to tell him that anti-Semitism is a problem in Australia right now. We can all see that, but he's done very little about it during his prime ministership. So Gillian Segal has now come out and come up with a few suggestions, among them that if you attack a synagogue, you should face mandatory minimum sentencing, that meaning you will have to go to jail, and that there ought to be a national cabinet meeting to discuss anti-Semitism. Here she was talking to Chris Kenny earlier tonight.
Infecting our community with hate and attacking places of worship in particular, but other places in order to intimidate the Jewish community, they should actually result in jail time. We need to make sure as a community that we convey to those bringing prosecutions and those assessing the penalties how serious this is for the future of our country.
Well, what would you know? The Prime Minister, who appointed someone to tell him what to do about anti-Semitism, now says, no, I'm not going to do what the person who I appointed to tell me what to do about anti-Semitism has told me to do. He was at a press conference today.
Well, I actually spoke with Gillian Segal yesterday a couple of times. We convened a meeting yesterday with myself, the Premier of Victoria, the Acting Premier of New South Wales, and the AFP Commissioner to coordinate activity. We have Operation Avalite that is in place. What I want is to ensure that any act of anti-Semitism, that it stops. And I want people who are responsible for these acts to be prosecuted fully, because they are a crime, and people should be held to account with the full force of the law.
Now, I think the Prime Minister does actually have a point here, that being that an attack on a synagogue having mandatory minimum sentencing would be an extraordinary move, one that has to be made by the states, not at a federal level, because, of course, that's where the criminal codes lie. But normally mandatory minimum sentencing is applied to the worst of the worst crimes, things like murder, rape, child abuse, etc. And also, what did National Cabinet ever achieve? I'm not sure that having another meeting would ever actually do anything. But it proves the point, does it not, that when he appointed a special envoy on anti-Semitism, it wasn't so that he could actually get any advice that he would ever take any notice of or that he particularly cared about. He was simply trying to say to the Jewish community, look, I'm doing something now, It was always window dressing. He's proved it today. He doesn't want the advice.
That isn't to say, though, that he won't take future advice or he hasn't taken past advice. And like you say, he does have a point here. There's the matter of jurisdiction. National Council would involve, obviously, all of the premiers, whereas we know that the hotspots here in Australia are New South Wales, namely Sydney, and Victoria, namely Melbourne. And he was talking to Minns and Allen just yesterday. So he really is honing in on those troubled spots. As for mandatory sentencing, I mean, even for the heinous crimes that you named there, mandatory sentencing, the reason why there isn't many of them is because it's so fraught. For the uninitiated, that simply means that the sentence is already decided. So if and when you are convicted of a particular crime, the judge doesn't have much to deliberate over. You get the mandatory sentence regardless of the circumstances. But let's for a second imagine that we have found the person who's burnt down the synagogue in Melbourne, and it turns out that they were bribed They were told that their family would be killed, etc., and so on. So when we're talking about mandatory sentencing, we're talking about an instance in which any of those situations, any other extenuating circumstances are thrown out the window and someone is simply given cut, copy, paste every single time the same sentence. And I do think that it would be a curious thing to have a special sentence for the burning down of a synagogue as opposed to somebody's church, somebody's mosque, or any other person's place of worship.
I think that what the envoy is trying to say is that there's a distinction between a church being set on fire right now or a mosque as compared to a synagogue. A church fire right now would be an isolated incident. But we've had...
but that's called knee-jerk legislation, and it's always a bad idea.
Well, I would say 15 months of anti-Semitic attacks without any action maybe requires a bit of knee-jerking, and that must be the frustration amongst the Jewish community.
But the knee-jerking is the special Operation Avalite that he's talked about.
Yeah, and what does it achieve? We had a fire in a mosque, a month ago. They initially said we've got 3 suspects. We're afraid they might flee the country. We've heard nothing since. Nothing has happened, and this is the frustration that must be being felt by the Jewish community. You said mandatory sentencing would be an extraordinary move. Agreed. But are we not living in extraordinary times? And as for jurisdiction, well, she said that's why we need to have a national cabinet. They had a national cabinet meeting about social media, for goodness sake, but won't have one about anti-Semitism. This is an insult to the Jewish community. If you're going to ignore their advice, and her advice is, could we have a discussion from the premiers?
So then would you say if he doesn't take all of the envoy's advice, that's insulting the Jewish community? I'm saying that this
advice that she has given is pretty innocuous. Get the premiers together, have a national coordinated response to anti-Semitism so we're all on the same page. That would be the least, I reckon, that we could do to address a subject that's been allowed to go on and on and on for 15 months. And while you're at it, talk about mandatory sentencing, and it would be nice if someone got arrested in the first place.
But I think we're rather missing...
States, which is why National Council never works. We saw this during COVID.
Even if it doesn't work.
They have their meetings and then they walk away and they say, I've got my own fiefdom and I run it the way I want to. But what does it say to the Jewish community
that social media was important enough to call everybody together, but apparently anti-Semitism isn't important enough?
But why are you shocked that Albo isn't changing his tune after all this time?
I
think this is the message that he's been sending to the Jewish community. No one's saying
we're getting caught in the weeds here of, why is he not doing something now about what the anti-Semitism invoice is he should do? He's failed to do anything for 15 months. I mean, it's not going to change now because someone else has told him what to do. We know the stripes of the Prime Minister, as if we would expect him to change now. I'm not saying that's right, but we can jump up and down now and say, oh, well, he hasn't taken the advice. He didn't want the advice in the first place. So what I would say
is he would have been better off not appointing any anti-Semitic.
Yeah, because it was tokenism. When he appointed that envoy, it was
injury by having her and ignoring her.
It was pure tokenism on the part of the Prime Minister.
Applause, much like now sending the Attorney General to Israel, and we're all like, oh yeah, golf clap, buddy, amazing. Everyone's convinced you've done a complete 180. Not